And I thank you, everyone, for being here, and I thank you for your kind thoughts during the week for the cold. I woke up last week and I couldn't talk for more than a few minutes. I would go into a coughing fit, and I didn't want to do that on the bridge. I'm sure that I'm sure that listening to someone cough over a microphone is not the greatest thing in the world. But all is good now. All is well. So thank you, and thank you for being with us. And we're coming back now to the third chapter of what we call the Back to Basics. This goes on in Centers for Spiritual Living, formerly religious science churches, all over the world. Back to the basics. We come back around once a year. We come back around and we go back and ask ourselves, what do I really believe? What do I really think? And it's important, as I say, for a couple of reasons. There's an old saying that says you can't step into the same stream twice. And it's true. The water that was there the first time is now gone. It's moved downstream. But you're not the same person any longer. You've changed. You've grown. Your ideas have grown and changed. And it's very important to come back and look at things again from time to time, to go back and revisit them, to increase in understanding, to increase in wisdom, might be how the Bible would put it. You've all heard the story about the man who said he had 20 years experience in the job, and his boss told him, no, you've got 1 year experience 20 times. You haven't learned anything. You haven't grown in your position. And we don't want to be like that. We don't want to have the sun go, the earth rotate around the sun one more time and have ourselves in the same place in consciousness that we were a year ago. There's so much to this universe. There's so much to life. There's so much to God. Dr. Holmes tells us that no one person, none of us, the greatest mystic who has ever lived, has completely plumbed the depths of God. And this is something that's incomprehensible to us. I just chuckled to myself because it just reminded me of the movie Princess Bride, where the guy kept saying, inconceivable, inconceivable. Our human experience is a finite experience. The human experience now. And we're more complex than that. That's what's so beautiful about this. We're more complex than that. On the surface, we appear to be skin and bones and things like that. But there's a part of us that has this deeper inner knowing. There's a part of us that is connected to that which simply is. And we know that. But for all outward appearances, and remember, this is why we're told not to judge by appearances, for all outward appearances, everything is finite, Everything that we know is finite. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And we tend to judge everything, we tend to put everything that we think about in that context of the human experience. And yet there is that within us which remembers the Garden of Eden experience. It remembers that. We long to be back home. Right? Joni Mitchell. We've got to get ourselves back into the garden. And the way that we do that is each and every day, and if we can, each and every minute of each and every day, each and every hour of each and every day, we are keeping ourselves mindful of our connection with God, mindful of our connection with each other. We appear to be separate individual beings. We have different bodies, different shapes, all these things, different desires, different attitudes, different background, education, and experience. But if we can step back beyond that, if we can look past that, not to disrespect it, because each individual's unique experience is a gift to the world, if we will see it as that. But we must also recognize that beyond those seeming differences, we are the same. We are one. We are attached at the soul. I gave you the example a couple weeks ago, and for those who had kids and you remember the little toy, I think it's called a light bright, that this is kind of like that. You know, imagine that we had one window in the room and the sunlight was streaming through it. And we took a black curtain and we put the black curtain over that window so we completely blocked out the light. And then we took a pin and we put little pinholes in and around the curtain so that different streams of light came in, you know. And each one would appear to be different where they shine on the floor, you know. And in the toy, the light bright, they take little plastic or lucite pegs of different colors and they stick them in the holes. So some of the streams of light become red or become blue or become yellow. And they each appear different, but they're all the same. They are all the one light expressing itself uniquely through each and every one. And of course, in the child's toy, there's a pattern, and you put the pegs into the black. It's construction paper. You put it in according to this pattern. And when the child is done, then what happens is all of these different little points of light make something different. Together, they make something different. It might be a little animal like a bunny rabbit, or it might be a house. But it takes each little point of light with its uniqueness to make this something new, this something different. And yet it is all the same light. It is all the same light. So I invite you to kind of keep that picture in mind as we go through these ideas today. You know? What we're hoping is that as we have come back around, that we are not stepping into the same stream we stepped into a year ago. Life has moved on. Things have changed. Not very much. Human consciousness as a collective doesn't change a whole lot, but it's changed. But your individualized consciousness, that you can control, that you can consciously choose to develop. Many times when we get started in this teaching and we start talking about how everything that's transpiring in the world today is the outpicturing of the sum total of human consciousness as it exists today, which it is, our students immediately wonder, well, how can we go out there and change all of human consciousness? And the answer to that is you can only work with what you are and where you are and what you have, which is your own consciousness. And if you can't change your own consciousness, you're of no use to anybody else anyway. It's like being on the airplane and the mask comes down. You've got to put yours on before you take care of your child, because if you pass out, the child doesn't have you to help it. So what we must do is we must learn first to do that which we can, which is to work with our own consciousness. And in so doing, we have an impact. We have an impact on what Carl Jung would call the collective consciousness, what Ernest Holmes would call the race consciousness. We have an impact on that. So the answer to how do we have an impact on all of human consciousness is we stop trying to fix everyone else out there. We let go of our focus on the splinter in our brother's eyes, and we start with the plank in our own. That's what the New Testament is telling us. You know. Are we growing? Is it our intention to grow? Are we in the same place we were last year? Hopefully not. But if we are, do we want to be in the same place a year from now? Forever and ever. That's what I was starting to get to. The human mind cannot conceive of forever and ever. It is beyond our ability to understand. But we can conceive of the now. We understand what now is. And I think the thing that helped me most as I was growing is to understand that which we learned as children in fairy tales forever and ever is simply the eternal now. God is now. Life is now. Love is now. Truth is now, right now. And the psychologists will tell us, our human mind, we're always kind of flitting back to the past, and usually we are remembering things that we regret, or we are flitting forward to the future. And in many cases, we are flitting forward with worry, anticipating the future with worry. Maybe not. Maybe we're anticipating the future with great joy. But even if we're anticipating the future with great joy, even if we are remembering very wonderful things that happened in the past, we're not here. We're not now. Be here now. Mindfulness. So our growth largely is a matter of us utilizing the here and now, bringing ourselves here and now, right? Taking our consciousness from whatever went on in the past, taking our consciousness from whatever might happen in the future, and bringing ourselves to the here and the now. And in this here and now, in this place of consciousness, in this here and now, recognizing that we are talking about before the appearances, before the illusions, before the separation, before leaving the garden, metaphysically, in that place of oneness, in that place of isness, in that place of suchness, that God is all there is. We're going over this morning the third chapter to the introduction of the textbook. And I just wanted to give you just very, very, very brief ideas on how I use this book. It's called a textbook because it has become standardized. Right? It's The Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes. And the first edition was published in 1926. Excuse me. And that edition is available out on the internet in PDF format. If you search for Science of Mind 1926, you'll find it and you can download it. And that first edition was a series of metaphysical lessons. And in it, Dr. Holmes talked to his metaphysical charts, which are in the back of every version of the textbook. And you'll recognize that it is a circle that is separated by two parallel horizontal lines. So the circle is cut into thirds, top, middle, bottom. And then he goes on to use those circles to explain his ideas. The top might be Father, the middle might be Holy Spirit, the bottom might be Son. It might be Spirit, it might be law, it might be demonstration. He talks to it several different ways to try to get us to get the point. And that was the first edition of the textbook, and it's very valuable to read for a serious student. Right? And part of our growth is, are we encouraging ourselves to read more? Are we encouraging ourselves to do more spiritual practice? Are we encouraging ourselves every minute of every day that we consciously can, to remember that God is all there is, even in the midst of doing our daily activities, even in the midst of answering phones, even in the midst of typing emails or filling out invoices or doing whatever it is that we do, our activities during the day. Can we bring ourselves to recognize that the person we are engaged with, communicating, is an expression of God, that we are an expression of God, that God's love is all that matters. And by reading and studying and listening to tapes and those sorts of things, we are constantly bringing ourselves back to those ideas. There are many examples in the Bible, both the Bible that we use here in the West, which consists of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the Old Testament and the New Testament, most people call it. There are many examples of God as a shepherd. God is the good shepherd. The Lord shepherds me, I lack nothing. He maketh me to lie down in the green pastures. See? There are many examples of the shepherd, and we have to keep in mind that in that culture, the culture from which these ideas come, the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep is not the one that we would envision today, but it was more like a caretaker and his pets. The sheep had names. The good shepherd knew every name, knew every sheep by name, and they didn't kill the animals for food. They raised the sheep for wool, and they raised the goats for milk. So they didn't kill the animals, right? They kept them. And if something happened to an animal, if it fell and it got hurt and it had to be euthanized, they would eat it. They wouldn't waste the meat. They would eat it. And there was a blessing. You see, when they had this meal that they had to eat, they couldn't eat it all, eat all of it. So they would invite the friends to come, so that the carcass didn't get wasted. And the toast or the blessing that the neighbors would offer the shepherd is, may you never have meat on your table again. So, we would hear that and say, what does that mean? And it means, I hope you never lose your friend again. I hope you never have meat on your table again. So this idea of the shepherd and the sheep, you have to understand, is a very intimate relationship, a very caring relationship. And one of the things that the shepherd had was, they had the crook, the famous staff with the big bow on the end of it. And that was to discipline the sheep. And it was also to rescue them. If they fell into a ditch, they could use that hook and they could lift them out. But if, as the shepherd was walking along, if the young lamb would kind of stray too far, the shepherd could reach out with the stick and just gently bring it back, just gently bring it back. If it moved the other way, it would gently bring it back. So in this manner, it taught the little ones to stay close to it, because it was their protection, right? The Lord shepherds me. It was their protection. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. See, when they were going through a narrow place, the predators could hide in the rocks. The wolves could hide in the rocks. Whatever the predator might be could hide in the rocks. If the little sheep got too far away from the shepherd, then the predator could just reach out and grab them. So they would learn to stay close to the shepherd. They would form a very, very tight pack as they walked through a very narrow place through the rocks. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadows of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me always. So we get this idea then that this discipline is just gently bringing ourselves back closer to the presence of the divine, closer to the presence of God, closer to that which is leading us, which is guiding us, which is guarding us. And as we go through our daily lives, we can do that to our own thoughts. You see, we become shepherds of our own thoughts. Remember when I talked about the Christmas narrative, I said the shepherds were the people who watched what they were thinking. The flocks represented the thoughts, and the shepherds represented those who paid attention to their thoughts, and to them the presence of God with us was announced. So you and I are our own shepherds. You and I can deliberately choose to bring our thoughts back to God, to bring our thoughts back to the eternal now. And by reading and studying and questioning and listening and praying and meditating, we do those things. So this 1936 edition of the textbook became standardized. What happened was we had the first edition in 1926. Then in 1936 it was edited by Maud Allison Latham. And after that, what happened was teachers all across the country started to design lesson plans off of this 1936 version of the textbook. So what they would say is, in their lesson plan, they would say, refer to page 237, paragraph 3. And then they would write a lesson based on whatever that said. So in order to keep the book standardized after that, it hasn't been revised since. And it's paginated the same way in every edition. So even if you get the large type edition or a newer edition, they're all paginated the same way. So if somebody says go to page 237, paragraph 3, all the books are the same at 237, paragraph 3. So the book has kind of become standardized, and I've read, these 4 chapters every year for more than 25 years, probably more than once a year. And the other chapters I've probably visited once a year or once every other year as I flip through the book. And what amazes me is how the book is constructed. The grammatical approach that is used in the book is so simple, kind of, to me, indicative of the way books were written in the 1920s and the 1930s. Each chapter starts off, the first paragraph has the most important ideas in the paragraph in it. And then all the other paragraphs kind of expand on that. And then within each paragraph, the first sentence has the most important sentence of the paragraph in it. And the remaining sentences in that paragraph just expand on that key idea. So if you want to review the key ideas in this textbook, if you start with the first paragraph, and typically the last paragraph, he constructs them like bookends, So if you look at the first paragraph, he'll give you the key ideas. And then somewhere close to the last paragraph, if not in the last paragraph itself, he summarizes the key ideas, So it's the old school of tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. And it makes it very easy to go back and review. But what makes it most interesting to me is every time I go back and do this, it says something different to me. It speaks to me differently because I'm not stepping into the same stream. I am not the same person. Consciousness has evolved. So today we're looking at the 3rd chapter of the introduction, What It Does. And I'm going to read the first paragraph verbatim, because if you can grasp this first paragraph, right, then everything else is just detail. Right? Remember the famous quote by Einstein, I want to know God's thoughts, everything else is detail. Grab this first paragraph, everything else is detail. And I'm quoting here. We should approach the study of this science rationally, never expecting to derive any benefits from it that its principle does not contain. For while it is true that we are immersed in an infinite intelligence, a mind that knows all things, it is also true that this intelligence can acquaint us with its ideas only as we are willing to receive them. The divine mind is infinite. It contains all knowledge and wisdom, but before it can reveal its secrets, it must have an outlet. This outlet we shall be compelled to supply through our own receptive mentalities. It is all that there is. It is expressing itself through us and as us. But it can only do so. Remember, the title is What It Does. It can only do so to the degree that we are willing to receive it. And it is through our consciousness, through our own receptive mentalities, that we receive it. So that's it in a nutshell. You can talk about it thousands of different ways, but that's the kernel. That's it right there. Now, I was telling someone the other day, and I don't know if you all remember this. I think I've talked about it once before. But many years ago, when I was a kid, we used to love learning science experiments. On TV was Mr. Wizard, and kids would faithfully watch that, and we would try to duplicate it. And it was a great show for kids. They always made the little experiments something that you could do with things that you had at home. and you could learn something as you went along. And one of the things that he demonstrated, and it was kind of demonstrated as you can try this trick on your friends, is, you put out a glass of water and you fill a glass of water almost to the top, and you tell your friend, I'll bet you $1 that I can stick my finger down all the way into that water and my finger won't get wet. And of course, if your friend hasn't seen Mr. Wizard, they'll say, oh, no way. And you say, sure. And they say, okay, so probably it was a dime in those days. Dollars were hard to come by in the 50s, so maybe it was a dime. And if they took the bait, what you would do is you would take a little jar of talcum powder, like baby powder, and you would sprinkle the talcum powder on top of the water in the glass until you had, maybe 1/4 of an inch of talcum powder floating on the top of the water. And then what you would do is take your finger and stick it down, pass it through the talcum powder and into the water. And when you pulled your finger back out, your skin was perfectly dry. The talcum powder would kind of form a seal around your finger and keep your finger from getting wet. God's love is all around us. God's love is like the water in the glass. We can immerse ourselves in it and still not get wet. This is why in the opening treatment I said we could stand under the waterfall and still not get wet. We can immerse ourselves, we are already immersed in God's love, but we can only absorb as much as we are willing to accept, only as much as we are willing to absorb. Okay. Our non-acceptance, for lack of a better term, is what prevents us from experiencing more of God, all of God. And the reason I say non-acceptance is that it's not like we deliberately get up in the morning and say, no, God, that's it. I don't want anything to do with you today. Stay out of my life, stay out of my affairs. It's not like that at all. It's more like we're just not consciously inviting. So we must consciously invite. So maybe a better way to put it is to say that talcum powder that keeps the skin dry is equivalent to our not consciously inviting the love of God into our experience that day. Dr. Holmes gives us another example somewhere else in his writings. And I haven't been to this place. I assume that it really exists. He speaks of it as if it is real and not a metaphor. But he says there's a valley in Colorado where the floor of the valley is just full of freshwater springs or geysers. He called them little geysers. But up in the mountains somewhere, there was a big reservoir, a big pool of water. And that the gravity pushed the water down through cracks in the rocks, down under the valley floor where the cracks became apparent in the valley floor. And the water would stream up through the cracks, and each one was different. Each one was unique. Some were wide and fat, and some were skinny and shot up higher, and each had a different shape to it. Each had a different style to it. The love of God is like the reservoir. The love of God is like that water. It is pushing through. It is like the sunlight on the other side of the black curtain. It is always ready. It is always willing. It is always able to push through where it finds receptivity. Where it finds receptivity. Most important. Most important. In the New Testament, Jesus tells the disciples, right, those who are learning how to stay close to the presence of God, the disciples, Jesus tells them that before they ask, the love of God knows what they want. But they should ask believing in their hearts that it is so. Now this is most puzzling sometimes, most puzzling. If God knows what we want or what we need, why do we even have to ask? If God is the author of health, why do we have to pray to remove sickness? What does this mean? And to me, it means that our asking, believing in our hearts is our way of accepting. Our way of accepting. The water in the glass cannot force its way through the talcum powder. The water in the reservoir in the mountains cannot force its way through the valley floor. There has to be an opening for it to work with. And asking, believing in our hearts, asking, believing in our hearts is our way of deliberately, consciously, and carefully creating that opening for God's love. We understand then that there's one power, there's one life, there's one love in the universe, by whatever name we choose to call it. I use the word God. We could use spirit, we could use love, we could use nature, we could use whatever appeals to us, but there's only one. And it is ready, willing, and able to push itself through our experience, into our experience, to the degree that we consciously choose to accept it. Now, we have to keep in mind that we are unconsciously choosing all the time. And it will, in fact, demonstrate through our lives to the degree that we unconsciously tell it what we are accepting. And this is why we must deliberately choose our thoughts. We must become aware of our thoughts, and we must deliberately choose them. You know, when we're first learning how to do something, drive a car, or swing a golf club, or a tennis racket, or do anything, right? We learn by rote, and we learn in little increments, you know. So the example I use in golf, because many people are at least familiar with it, even if they don't play. In golf, you have certain fundamentals, you know. You have your stance, you have your grip, and you have your swing. And each of those components then can be broken down into other things that you learn. And with your stance, you stand so that if you're a right-handed player, you stand so that the ball is lined up with your left heel and you are completely perpendicular to it. And your grip, your pinkies overlap. And whatever it is you learn by rote, you learn the technique. And after a while, you forget all the little things that you learned, and you just kind of do it, and you do it by habit. If you're learning how to drive a car, you remember the first time you ever drove a car, it seemed to want to go faster than you thought it should be going, and it seemed to want to stop a whole lot quicker than you thought it should be stopping. And then you had to remember to turn on your blinkers, and you had to remember to turn on your headlights, and you had to learn all these different things. And then after a few months of practice, you just went and you just did it. But then what happens is you're doing all of these things without conscious thought. You're doing them more from a subconscious level, let's say that. Not unconscious. The subconscious is aware and it knows what it's doing. But your conscious mind, the top 1/3 of that circle, the spirit that Dr. Holmes is talking about, is not consciously paying attention to it. And this is necessary for the survival of the species, right? It was, you know, you learn something, you learn how to do it, and then you free your mind up to go do something else. But what happens is while we are doing these things without consciously thinking about them, bad habits creep in. We start to do things without even consciously thinking about them. And if we want to break a habit, we have to somehow come back and force ourselves to be consciously aware of what we're doing. This is where a coach comes in. Usually you hire a coach because a coach observes your behavior and points out to you things that you're doing that you're not aware that you're doing. Whether it be a driving coach or a golf coach or any kind of a coach. The coach comes in and says, why did you do that? Why are you standing that way? Why are you holding the club this way? A driving coach says, why are you doing this? You know, did you know that you didn't turn your head when you pulled out into traffic? Whatever it might be, sometimes we need somebody to observe us and tell us what's going on. And we have to learn how to become our own coach when it comes to spiritual matters. And we have to learn how to observe ourselves and pay attention and ask ourselves, what was I just thinking? What just happened in my life? What's going on here? So what we want to consider then is that we have come into this world not fully enlightened. Right? It's our job to become more aware as we go along, so that as we do so, we become more aware in a unique, personalized, individualized way. That light that's streaming through those little holes in the curtain is becoming unique in some way. We're coloring it with our own personality. We're shaping it with our own ideas and our own thoughts. And God is expressing itself uniquely as us. As each blade of grass is different, as each flower is different, as each snowflake is different, out of that one comes many. But we know many things that we are not consciously aware of knowing, and we have fallen into many bad habits in our thought. And we come back to the basics once a year as a way of saying to ourselves, kind of pinching ourselves awake and saying, are you paying attention? Are you willing to pay attention? What's going on in your life? So the essence of it, the essence of this chapter, and I invite you to read this chapter sometime today, sometime during the week. I invite you to read it. And the reason I suggest that is what you're going to take out of it is going to be entirely different than what I took out of it. Because we're in different streams. Because we're different people, because we're having different experiences. But what the essence of this is, if we can mystically grab hold of it, see, if we can mystically get into the feeling that there's just one life, there's just one love, there's just one God. We are immersed in it. It is immersed in us. We are surrounded by it. It is like the water in the glass. It is quite willing. It is quite willing to let us get wet. But we have to let it in. We have to deliberately let it in. And it's not enough to say, well, I didn't consciously choose to push it out. That's not enough. We have to consciously choose to let it in. We must believe in our hearts. We must accept. We must declare the good that we would experience in our lives. And we must do so by rote until it becomes habit. I tell my students sometimes, you know when you're really getting this when you are treating in your dreams. If you have a dream that something's going on, someone is sick or something has happened, and in your dream you stop and do a treatment, you're really starting to get this at the subconscious level. As the little sheep and lambs are learning, they need the discipline of the Good Shepherd to bring them back in, to use that shepherd's staff, to bring them back in, to bring them closer to the presence of God, walking through the valley of the shadows, to bring them to the safe place. As you and I go through life, we have teachers and books and lectures that help do the same. But they're not by themselves enough. They're not by themselves enough. Our teachers can't accept for us. We must accept for ourselves. So what I invite you to do this year as you read this chapter, as you read through it, I invite you to declare your acceptance. That whatever way is best and appropriate for you, the love of God is this instant, this minute, this day revealing itself to you. that all of the goodness and all of the perfection and all of the health and all of the prosperity and all of the loving relationships and all of the fulfilling activities and all of the perfect spiritual paths that are appropriate for you are already here, are already now. They are surrounding you. They are trying to get through to you. But they require something that only you can do. And that is, as Dr. Holmes said, your willingness to accept, to create your own receptive mentality. Create your own receptive mentality, and that requires your conscious choice. It requires more than conscious rejection. It requires your conscious acceptance. When the light is turned on, the darkness is dispelled, and what you are doing with your conscious acceptance, with your reading, with your prayer, with your treatment, with your meditation, with your listening to tapes and lectures, what you're doing with all of that is you are consciously accepting the love of God into your life. And this is something that you can practice all of the time. When you take a bite of food, can you bless it? Can you recognize it as the presence and the activity of God in your life? When you get a moment, can you stop and just breathe and rejoice in the miracle that breathing is, that life is, the gift from God? Can you look in the mirror and take marvel at the mechanics of the human body that have been created from the dust of the earth? Spirit does all of this by becoming these things. And it will do all of this and more in, as, and through you when you create the open channel, the receptive consciousness, the willingness. Louise Hay says that when she was working with her students, whatever it was that they wanted, she would ask them, are you willing to accept that right now? And sometimes the honest answer was, no, I'm not really ready right now. And she would then ask, are you willing to become willing? Wherever you are you willing to become willing? Are you willing to accept the love, the presence, and the activity of God in, as, and through you? Are you willing to surrender and let go of every and any idea in consciousness, whether you are aware of it or not aware of it, that in any way, shape, or form tries to limit the activity of God in your life? Are you willing to take time to be mindful? Set the little timer on your watch, your Fitbit, to beep at you every once in a while, to remind you to think about what you're thinking about. The very love of God has created each and every one of us out of itself. We are here to learn more about what it as us is. The only place we can do that is within our own mentalities, in our own consciousness. And the only time we can do that is now, right here and right now. We can't do it in the past. We can't do it in the future. We have to do it now. So I invite you, take time to be mindful. Take time to think about these things that we're talking about. Take time to read the chapter in a textbook. But most importantly, take time to just be still, to sit with God's love, and to feel grateful for it. And so it is. And this morning, in lieu of a closing treatment, I am going to flip to the back of that chapter. I read the opening paragraph of the chapter at the beginning. I am going to flip back towards the end of the chapter to what is on page 46 of the textbook, and it is in a section titled "The Principle Restated." It's 3 paragraphs long. Dr. Holmes' words. Let us restate our principle. We are surrounded by an infinite possibility. It is goodness, life, law, and reason. In expressing itself through us, it becomes more fully conscious of its own being. Therefore, it wishes to express through us as it passes into our being. It automatically becomes the law of our lives. It can pass into expression through us only as we consciously allow it to do so. Therefore, we should have faith in it and in its desires and its abilities to do for us all that we shall ever need to have done. Since it must pass through our consciousness to operate for us, we must be conscious that it is doing so. The one who wishes to demonstrate some particular good must become conscious of this particular good if he wishes to experience it. Therefore, he must make his mind receptive to it and must do this consciously. There is no hocus pocus in a mental treatment. It is always definite, conscious, concrete, and explicit. We are dealing with intelligence, and we should deal with it intelligently. There is no occult trick in giving scientific treatments. It is just the reverse. Simplicity should mark our every effort, and positivity should accompany all statements that we make into the law of good. And so it is. Mastermind is tomorrow night, 7 p.m. on the Conference Bridge. Skype group is going to meet Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. and we are working on Chapter 6 of A New Design for Living, which is a great book by Ernest Holmes. Anyone out there who doesn't have it, I suggest that you get it and read it. Even if you don't want to join the Skype group, please get that book and read it. It's one he wrote very near the end of his career, and it seems to be a very succinct summarization of everything he taught over a 40-year period. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for taking this time to love yourself enough to open your hearts and your minds to growth. Thank you for the gifts that you send in, for your love for Lori and I, for your prayers for both of us. Thank you for just being you. We are delightful to have you as part of this family of love. Have a great week, and so it is.